Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Coach's Corner. I'm Jeffrey Hartford, your host rather, and the coach. I am the conduit of optimism, altruism, consciousness, and health. And today I've been blessed to have Dr. Stephen Hussey join us. Dr. Hussey, welcome.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
My pleasure for sure. Yeah. As I was telling you before I hit record, I've got your book here, one of your books, Health Evolution. I know you also wrote Pain, Sense, and Understanding the Heart. And Dr. Hussey is a doctor of chiropractic with a master's in nutrition and functional medicine. And I'll tell you, in a moment, I plan on cracking the book open. There's something in here that I really want to read to the audience. But with that quick intro, I'll toss it over to you. I want to kind of hear a little bit from you, your backstory. I know in your youth, you had some ailments you had to deal with, the type 1 diabetes, some different inflammatory issues. And I imagine that's really what pushed you down this path of wanting to learn a whole lot more about medicine.
For sure. Yeah, as a kid, I had a lot of inflammatory conditions. I guess you can call them inflammatory conditions. I had irritable bowel syndrome. I had allergies, terrible hives. They used to just break out in hives all over my body. So ultimately ended up with type 1 diabetes at the age of 9, which the theory is that's autoimmune. My body attacked the cells that make insulin. My parents and I were very reliant on Western medicine to give us explanations and strategies for managing those conditions. But the key word was manage them. It wasn't an explanation of why they're there in the first place, or why, we're getting so sick as a population in the first place. It was just, well, what can we do about the symptoms and try and suppress them and hope it goes away on its own kind of. But I didn't really become aware of that until college, or the fact that that's what they were doing until college, because in college, I majored in health and wellness, and I started changing my lifestyle to some degree and noticed that it had an impact on my ability to manage. And even I got rid of some of these inflammatory type symptoms that I had. And I thought that it was interesting that no physician, because I've seen physicians my entire life as a type 1 diabetic, every 6 months, every 3 months, going to an endocrinologist. None of them ever told me, well, you could change your lifestyle and fix these things. So that was interesting. And it kind of steered me away from pursuing any sort of medical degree. Because at that time I had a good relationship with my pediatric endocrinologist, and he was a really awesome guy. I see the flaws in some of his ways of thinking now, looking back, but he was a really great guy. And I kind of was inspired to go into medicine because of him. But I was just like, well, I don't know if I want to learn that type of medicine. It didn't really tell him the answers to give me. So my parents had always taken me to chiropractors. So I decided to go to chiropractic school. And, through chiropractic school and my master's degree, it was just always changing lifestyle in different ways, learning new things, and just kind of trial and error, figuring out how I can best live my life to be healthy. And so that's kind of what, inspired my journey. And, I've had health ups and downs since then. And every time those things happen, I try and, learn about it the best I can and change things. And I've come across some pretty interesting things. And I've learned that, I talk a lot about heart disease because that's very relevant to me as a type 1 diabetic. But also just physiology in general. I've learned that most of what, you learn in a formal medical education, whether it's chiropractic school, naturopathic school, medical school, is wrong, or at least not the whole truth. And there's more information. There's different theories out there. And we have to keep that conversation open. We can't close the door on those conversations, because then we'll never really understand how physiology actually works and how we keep it healthy. So that's kind of what's been driving me most of my adult life.
It's fantastic. And, it really makes me think about this movement that we're seeing towards decentralized medicine, and really getting to this point where it's really about empowering people as opposed to disempowering. And, as you touch upon with some of the doctors you experienced, I'm sure they were wonderful people that got into medicine because they wanted to help people, but they were handcuffed by, I would say, the system that, whether we want to dive into trying to determine intent or not. I mean, clearly money's driving it, and optimizing health is not. So, we get to that point where we realize, all right, thankfully you recognize that before you sign the papers to get your debt from the education that you then had to be handcuffed into, and have your 4 minutes with a patient and write a script as they walked out the door. We hear it from so many different doctors now, but that does bring us to the quote that I wanted to get to. I shared this on my Facebook page too. Just, it spoke to me and I had to share this with people.
Nice.
It says, many doctors, including me, are tired of practicing in our broken healthcare system. We're discovering new ways of offering care that seeks to help patients achieve well-being instead of pursuing solely the absence of symptoms and the profit of conventional medicine system. And that's the answer right there. When we can get to this point, again, in this decentralized movement of finding out what it is that the body is either having too much of or not getting enough of that is resulting in these ailments, in these symptoms, it's certainly not a deficiency of a pharmaceutical drug. There's something. We either have a lack of nutrients, something the body needs, whether it's from food or nature, from the sun, what have you, or if it's an excess of toxins. It seems to be that's our equation that we need to balance out. Now, in all of your journey, I know you had your heart attack and you really commend the doctors. I mean, that's a prime example of when Western medicine is a true godsend, that in a traumatic case, they saved your life, even though they left you with some complications that you had to resolve after the fact. So I'll throw that to you and let you explain that a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, since that time in college and chiropractic school, when I was changing my lifestyle, I was largely changing diet and exercise. I'd always played sports my whole life, so the exercise part was easy to keep up. But the diet part was radically changed. And so I would always, since that time, eating a whole foods diet and manage my blood sugar as well. My A1C as a type 1 was always lower than 6.5, which is pretty good. Sometimes much lower than that, sometimes around that number. And it seems to vary for type 1 diabetics. Some of them can control it super well, and with just diet alone. But yeah, it's different the more and more type 1s I meet. But yeah, so generally took care of myself, thinking I had things figured out. And then about, I guess it was 3.5 years ago, I had a widowmaker heart attack, a 100% blockage of the left anterior descending artery in my heart. And there's so many things to unpack about this, but I'll just kind of generally go through the story. In that 6 months prior to the heart attack, I got a C.A.C.H score done, which is a measurement of how much calcified plaque there is in the arteries of your heart. Mm-hmm. So how much calcium shows up on there. And my score was a perfect 0. So there was no calcification of any arteries. Now, that doesn't tell you about soft plaque, if it's there or not. But there was no, to have, what medicine would make you think is that, okay, well, there's 100% blockage and that's what caused the heart attack. However, it's hard for me to believe that a 100% blockage slowly formed over time and none of it calcified. None of it was calcified. That's doesn't make sense to me. So it's much more likely that it was a spontaneous clot that formed instantaneously and blocked the artery. Because when they went in to do the angiogram and place the stent and open up the blockage, they found no atherosclerosis in my arteries, just this one spot where it was totally blocked, which is also rare, or which is also interesting. Like if I had this one spot that was totally blocked, but there was no plaque anywhere else, that's also interesting. So it points to this idea that it was a spontaneous clot that instantaneously blocked the artery. But I'll never know exactly, and no one will ever be able to tell me exactly what caused this. I have many different theories of what causes heart attacks. And because there are heart attacks that happen when they find no blockage whatsoever. So how did that heart tissue die? So lots of different avenues here. But anyways, I was pretty demoralized in the hospital, not knowing what to do or why this happened. And, was just asking the doctors, well, what do you think? Even knowing what I knew at this point, I was still just curious, what do you think? And they were just broken record. Oh, these things are caused by cholesterol. These things are caused by cholesterol. And it was just, I was just well, what about this? What about that? And they were like, no, it's cholesterol. And I was just okay. And based on the, approach that was taken in the hospital and the advice I was getting, which included like eating a processed food diet. That was like one thing they told me to do. Um, like I just quickly got reinvigorated and I was like, okay, this is not what I'm going to do. And people are unfortunately going to be in the situation that I was in, laying in the hospital, getting that advice. So now it's become sort of my mission to share a different perspective, so that people get all the information so that they can decide based on all the information, because I saw firsthand that people are not getting all the information in that situation. So um, I left the hospital after 3 days, which they didn't want to let me go. They said that was too soon, but I was like, we're not doing anything here, let me go. And so they let me go. And I started my own like uh, heart healing routine, I guess I call it, which, involved certain things that we'll talk about. But at the 3 month echocardiogram to reassess things, my heart ejection fraction had improved to normal because it was damaged. And so there was low ejection fraction. It was down to like 35% ejection fraction, and mine was up to 55, which is in normal range. And then the conductivity of my heart, like the electrical signal coming through the heart, was akinetic in some areas of my heart after the heart attack. And at 3 months, it was pretty much normal. So at the time, the doctors were like, well, the medications are working. And I was like, well, actually, I haven't taken any of them aside from the blood thinner that I took for 6 months, because there was a stent in my heart and I wanted to make sure that didn't cause any issues until it became incorporated into the artery wall. So they were just like, they were kind of, upset that I hadn't been taking them. And I was like, well, they clearly weren't needed. And that's just my example, just one thing I did. For me, it doesn't mean that it'll happen that way for everybody. But yeah, then as you mentioned, I had other complications. So the the heart cath that they did, they tried to go in through my wrist, an artery in my wrist, the radial artery, but they abandoned that pretty quickly and went to the artery in my leg, the femoral artery in my groin. And after they did the procedure that busted the clot and everything and saved me, they used this device called an angioseal that goes around the artery. And they use that device because people who have those procedures have, like, for the artery to heal, they have to lay there for like 3 or 4 days for that to heal. Yeah. And so with the angioseal device, you can sit up within 12 hours, which is a big deal for lots of people who may develop clotting and stuff for being stagnant, laying in bed like that. But I have also found literature that shows that that device can interfere with blood flow dynamics going into your leg. And so maybe, it was around that time I got that echocardiogram. I started, being more active again. I started trying to do more walking and tried to just, be more active. And my leg, my lower right leg below the knee, was extremely painful when I would do that. And at first I didn't know what it was. I was like trying to diagnose myself. I was like, what is this? Like a deep vein thrombosis? Do I have compartment syndrome? What is going on here? And eventually got around. It was probably 6 months after the heart attack that I finally decided to go ask a doctor about it. And they did a Doppler ultrasound, and they had a 75 to 99% stenosis, or narrowing of the artery in my thigh, the distal femoral artery. And so that was restricting the blood flow into my leg. So if I was at rest, it was fine. But if I tried to exert myself, I wasn't getting enough blood, and then my leg would be very painful. And so I was like, well, dang, that sucks. And at the time, they said, the vascular surgeon I eventually saw said, well, you're able to do what you need to do in your life. You just can't do some of the things you like to do. So let's just leave it alone, because if we start messing with them, usually they get worse. And I said, okay, fair enough. But I started doing, again, my heart healing routine, which I started doing infrared sauna. I started doing a lot of grounding. I started prioritizing and getting sunlight exposure. And I started optimizing circadian rhythm. Everything else I did stayed the same. So my diet stayed the same, was very low carb, very animal based. My lipid levels, my LDL and total cholesterol stayed the same, which was elevated. My stress, unfortunately, stayed about the same, maybe even got worse during this time. But I changed those things. I did sauna, sunlight, grounding, and circadian rhythm. And a year later, I did the test again, and it was only 0 to 50% blocked.
Wow.
And at that time, the vascular surgeon said, "Well, we can't say that it's better because we don't see these things get better." And I was like, "Well, I mean, it's getting better. Like the test shows that it's better." And the technician that did the test actually did the test, and she left the room, and then she came back in like 5-10 minutes later and was like, "Hey, we're gonna do it again. We saw some things that didn't match up or whatever." So they did the whole test again. So it was confirmed twice
Wow.
that it was better. And then a year after that, I continued doing my stuff that I'm doing. And a year after that, I went back and the artery was totally normal. So I completely reversed a 70 to 99% blockage of plaque in the artery in my leg, which, if you look at the literature and you talk to vascular surgeons, it's impossible to do that. Like, and I'm told on X all the time by doctors that like, that's impossible. You didn't do that. And I'm like, well, why can I run now? Why can I play soccer without pain in my leg? If the testing is wrong, why can I do that when I couldn't before? Um, and and so, especially for a type 1 diabetic, because type 1 diabetics who develop peripheral artery disease have way worse outcomes than even type 2 diabetics, which is
Hmm.
surprising to me. They're more likely to have amputations and have complications from that, whereas I completely reversed it. So in my in my view of things, it's just like, well, why aren't they saying, let's study this person? Let's ask what
Right.
happened. Let's figure out how this happened and see if we can replicate it, even if not to the extent that he did, but we can at least improve outcomes in patients. But no doctor that I've encountered or on X or anywhere has ever said that. So where's the curiosity?
Amen.
It's just so sad to me. But it was the same thing in the hospital. There's lack of curiosity and complete shutdown of conversation as well. And there's no open door as to let's have discussions about these so we can get new information and determine different things. But yeah, so that's kind of my story, and I'm an N of one example of the fact that your body can heal itself, even in the face of things that can prevent it from healing, like type 1 diabetes and stress and things. Like, there are some powerful things that we're probably missing in our environments that allows our body to heal. And so I've really looked into all that stuff and tried to uncover as many of the mechanisms as I can, trying to understand it. And it's led me to so many different places about new understandings of physiology.
Yeah, it's really exciting to hear your story too. And while I'm sorry to hear that you had to go through it, I'm in a selfish way for myself and for the rest of the world. I'm grateful you did it and it was you. I have a sense that there's certain people that are given opportunities, is what I'll call it, and that's what you had. And my audience has already heard me talk about this a little bit, and we don't have to go too far down this path. But I had a similar opportunity present itself back in June. I was diagnosed with a tumor on my kidney that I was told is more likely than not cancer.
Mm-hmm.
And, my attitude, I got a very powerful rush of energy through my body from my feet all the way up to my head. And it just culminated in a smile. It was pure peace and calm. And I just had a sense that I know I'm going to be okay. I know my body's going to heal this, and I don't want standard of care treatment. And I know that's the path we're going down. So I think, I've been documenting, and I will continue to document as I go, and just be able to share with people what it is I did, and very similar changes. I mean, I'd say overall, for the most part, my lifestyle recently has been really good.
Mm-hmm.
I have a sense that this diagnosis is actually more from a previous version of me, the way I was in my youth. I did not take care of myself nearly as much. So that's the sense that I get. But, again, those of us that are given these opportunities and don't just fall to our knees and beg the doctors for help for them to do what they've continued to do. And in many cases, it's not really doing a whole heck of a lot. And as you said, within this centralized paradigm, there's not even any curiosity any longer. It's simply, I already went to school, I know all they taught, and I'm going to give you what I have. And just that the terminology, the decentralized, centralized, makes me often think of Dr. Jack Kruse. And you're one of the few that seems to have discovered this whole element of using the grounding, using the light, using all these different elements without coming across him first.
Yeah.
Your curiosity led you to the literature, and you found a very similar route. So I know you were able to utilize that protocol to come back from that atherosclerosis. Did you also start that protocol prior to that, or was it as a result of that?
Yeah, it was inspired. So at the time, I had done a lot of research on the heart
Mm-hmm.
because of my predisposition as a type 1 diabetic.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew this idea that the heart is not what moves the blood. And so I had looked into that idea before. And I was also very aware of the literature showing how beneficial an infrared sauna is for heart failure, people with heart failure. And that's what I was told. Like, there's damage to your heart. You're a super high risk for heart failure. That's why you got to be on these blood pressure medications. That's why you got to be on the blood thinners and all this kind of stuff. And I was like, well, I don't really want to do that. You're kind of like you know, but I didn't have a sauna before, but I knew the benefits of it. But I was just like, all right, I'm spending the money. I'm going to do it. So I got a sauna. And then I was like, and the sunlight is the original sauna. It's the most infrared light. So I got more sunlight. And then that put me in contact with the ground more because I was outside. At the time, I was living on 5 acres out near the woods. So I was just in contact with the ground a lot. And I was familiar with concepts of circadian rhythm, but I wasn't doing it necessarily
Mm-hmm.
as far as like being very conscious of blue light exposure. So it all started with just doing more sauna, being outside more, not really having exact protocols, just doing it, and then like all I would do is put on blue blocking glasses after sunset. Like that's what I started doing. I wasn't doing any of the morning stuff and trying to optimize it totally. I was just like, okay, let's just block the blue light after sunset.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how it started. And then I started researching more heavily the other things and getting into the literature and reading different scientists' work and their books and things like that. So it kind of evolved to this bigger understanding of how this works and why it works. All the while, I was unknowingly, doing these things that fixed it. It wasn't like even like my goal to like fix the atherosclerosis. My main goal was I want to prevent heart failure from
Mm-hmm.
developing. But in the meantime, those the same things did that. And so then I was like, well, that was awesome. So how did that work? How did I do that? And you look into the research and you're just like, oh, well, that makes sense. But you also like, research it is what it is. There's so many flaws in it, and it should never be the only way you dictate what you do, your strategies, but it can be useful, especially basic science research. But it just makes sense that humans come from outside. For however long you believe humans have been on Earth, we lived outside, and it's only in the last 80 years or so that we really started living more indoors, significant parts of the day indoors. And that's from artificial lighting and things like that. So yeah, there's a paper that I cite in my heart book and in my pain sense book I'm not going to get it exactly right, but it's like moving away from evidence-based medicine and toward medicine-based evidence.
Hmm.
And if you ask me, it makes more logical sense to do that. So basically looking at taking a case and documenting exactly what was done and what the outcome was for that person, and then lumping all those cases together somewhere where someone can look it up and say what has worked, what hasn't worked before. That's, to me, way more useful information than some mechanism that explains this, and then that potentially could be a treatment for this, and then you can market that and patent that, and then it becomes something that's that your doctors recommend. It's like backwards. Trying
Mm-hmm.
to figure out the mechanisms, and then you can't recommend that unless you have this proof through research. It's just like, well, what if someone's reversed it doing this? Who cares what the mechanisms are? Like, let's try it again with this person and see if it works. Like, that's way more useful, and it's way more relevant to the individual, because quite frankly, I'm sitting there, knowing that there's the literature on the medications and showing that it doesn't have an outcome, and knowing that there's no, direct literature that shows that, infrared sauna, grounding, sunlight, and optimizing circadian rhythm will reverse atherosclerosis.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't have time for the research. Someone to decide to do that research, get funding for it, do the long trials, and then figure it out. Like, I don't have time for that. And the average person doesn't have time for that. Like, I have to act right now. And so that's what was important to me. And so that's what's important to most people. So if we had a database like that, that would be way more useful for a physician to go look at and be like, oh, well, that's interesting. And that's kind of what case studies are. but case studies are seen as this very low form of research because
Mm-hmm.
it's not like a large, study group and it's just one person. It's just like, well, that's interesting. We should be looking at those things. But yeah, it's just interesting. I could pick apart research and how that's the basis for which we do things all day long.
Yeah.
Not to say that it's irrelevant. It's just not the end all be all.
That's right. We have to consider the money aspect of that too. When we
Mm.
consider the whole history of peer review journals is rooted in Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine Maxwell's dad, and it was all about money. And there's a whole side of it that most people are oblivious to and just assume that peer reviewed literature is hands down the best and double blind placebo controlled trials. And, as you said, it's not that it's not relevant, but we have to
Yeah.
consider the money aspect of it. And if we're actually looking to optimize our health and wellness, I mean, again, what just went through my mind, not only do we have in common that we're curious, there's something about those of us who look for the different path that we're looking to live. We're
Mm.
not sitting back and waiting to be told. And it's, again, this is a transition into the empowerment paradigm. We're walking away from disempowerment. We're walking away from, fear-based tactics, making you sit still frozen while you wait to be told, oh, we think we have an answer for you. And, that's why I think your story was so moving for me. So, there's so many different avenues we could go down now. You touched upon how the heart isn't really what's moving the blood through the body, and that's the whole Gerald Pollack story, right, with the easy water and all that. So we could definitely scratch the surface at least on that aspect. But I do want to come back. You mentioned the cholesterol before. Knowing you're doing low carb, I too have experienced that. I know you've referred to it before. The lean super responder, I think, is the phrase that you use. I've done carnivore and I saw my cholesterol numbers shoot up, but every other metric was within an optimal range. And I know now not to be afraid of a higher cholesterol. So that's two different big topics, but I'll throw those both at you and make sure we cover those.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a ton of literature out there that suggests that the heart is not what moves the blood, or at least it's not the main mover of blood.
Mm-hmm.
And just because we observe this heart contracting, quote unquote, pumping, we think it was assumed that the heart was the mover of the blood. But actually, the early describers of the vascular system, like William Harvey, he was the first guy who wrote that book to describe the circulation of the blood. He had doubts that the heart was able to move the blood around it. And he expressed this to letters to his colleagues, that he was just like, I don't see how this could happen. And there was lots of scientists in the early 1800s who did design experiments that basically showed that the heart, there's no way it could create enough force to move the blood throughout the entire body.
Mm-hmm.
And so the most comprehensive, I think, piece of literature on that topic is a book called The Heart and Circulation by Dr. Branko First. It reads like a 200-page research paper, just fair warning. But yeah, it's probably the most, and that was written, I think back in 2013. So there's probably a lot more today. I know there's a lot more today because of Dr. Pollack's work.
Mm-hmm.
So, so yeah, then people probably want to know, well, if that's the case, if that's true, then what does move the blood? And it's actually what's called it's the existence of fourth phase water in the arteries. So fourth phase water is the fact that water can exist in a fourth phase, not solid, liquid, or gas, but it's more like a gel.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of like the consistency of raw egg white. And this has been discovered and proven over and over again in the literature over the last 100 years by many different scientists, discovering it at many different times, that water has this gel state that it can get into. And when water holds energy, which the main source of energy is infrared light from the sun, and it's next to a biological surface, any surface in the body, it will become the structured water on that surface. It kind of sticks to that surface. And so Dr. Pollack has shown that this does indeed happen in the lining of the arteries. And because of the way that it forms, it actually creates blood flow. So they've done this over and over again. They've proven it in animal models, in the arteries of animals, and they've also done it in artificial models. Like they place a tube that's made of a hydrophilic or water-loving substance in a vat of water, and they put infrared light on the water, and the water starts to flow through the tube with no pump or anything acting on it.
Hmm.
And the reason that happens is because when structured water forms, it cleaves off one of the hydrogens of water, and so you're left with just the oxygen and hydrogen, and they kind of join together and make this lattice-like structure. That is what becomes the structured water. But since one of those hydrogens is gone, it makes the structured water very electronegative, because oxygen is the negative molecule and it's much bigger than just the one hydrogen. And also it's a very electronegative because now electrons can travel through it because it's connected together. The molecules are connected together. And so it becomes very electronegatively charged. And then the space next to the structured water is all those excess hydrogens that were cleaved off. So that's very positively charged because hydrogens are positive. And so that positive next to a negative is a battery, which is why we have a positive and negative end on a battery. That charge separation creates energy, or the opportunity for energy to be harvested. And they've actually shown that you can put an electrode, two different electrodes, into the positive and negative part of this water charge separation, and you can power a light bulb with it. The light bulb comes on. So it creates energy. It holds our energy. And in the case of a tube with fluid in it, it does the work of moving fluid. And so that's the main way the blood moves. And there are other ways too, but that's the main way that it moves, is that mechanism. But there's also paramagnetism and electrostatic properties, and there's the movement of breathing in the lungs and the gas exchange. There's also the one-way valves in the veins. There's muscle contractions, lots of different ways to keep blood moving, but the main way is the structured water. And so then people usually ask, well, then why is the heart there? What's its purpose? Why is it contracting? And there are various ways that you can energize water so that when it gets next to a hydrophilic surface, it structures itself. And one of the main way is infrared light, which makes sense because 40 to 50% of the sun's rays are infrared light. And again, we've already mentioned humans live outside. They should live outside. And so that's why that mechanism, came about. But another way you can structure water is by vortexing it. So basically swishing it around or spiraling it, or whatever you want to say. And that makes sense because water in nature is always moving. It's not stagnant. And if it does get stagnant, like in a pond or a puddle, it gets kind of dirty and gross. Whereas water that's flowing is always clean. And less debris and things like that. It's more beautiful to look at, I'd say, if we think about it. But it's always crashing on the beach and moving in tidal currents and flowing through rivers and evaporating and precipitating. Like, it's always moving. And so that's exactly what the heart is there for. So we have this water in blood, which is about half water, flowing through these laminar tubes. It's not getting swished around very much. And so you place this thing in the middle of the circulation, that it actually creates turbulence, that the blood has to flow in through these chambers. It gets pumped out. And when it gets pumped out, like contracted, it goes like this, then it goes through the valves and it creates a spiral current. And the way it flows in, like, it's crazy. They've looked at all this stuff, like the hydrodynamics of blood flowing through the heart. And when it goes into a chamber, it goes around the side and kind of spirals around. Kind of like when you put like a quarter in those things and it goes around like this,
Sure.
And it gets to the bottom. Like, that's how the blood comes into the ventricles of the heart. So it's just vortexing. It's just swishing the blood around. That's what it's for. So that when it gets out into the periphery, it's more energized so that it can structure itself, and that can create the movement of blood. But relying on the heart to do that itself is not wise. That's why we also need external things that energize water, like infrared light exposure and grounding and those types of things, to keep the blood adequately moving. So that's, the first purpose of the heart. The second purpose is that it maintains the pressure between the two systems, because if I was to exert myself, the tissue demand for oxygen and nutrients would be so high that all the blood would rush over to the arterial side, delivering it to tissues. And and then the venous side would collapse because it didn't have enough pressure. There's not enough fluid in the system to maintain the pressure. And so the heart actually, they've shown this in endurance athletes, that during exertion, the heart actually slows the flow of blood. to prevent it from rushing over to the arterial side, so it maintains the pressure between the two systems. And so an endurance athlete's heart that gets bigger, like it's cardio hypertrophy, it's the muscle is stronger because it's stronger at catching the blood and stopping it, not because it's stronger at forcefully pumping it, because that's not what the heart's supposed to do.
Yeah.
So that's those are the hydraulic or vascular aspects of why the heart is there. It's not to forcefully pump blood. It's to do other things. And so that's important to understand, because the very term heart failure is then a misnomer. Because
Mm-hmm.
if the blood is not moving properly and we're getting pull up of fluid in areas, we term that heart failure. The heart is failing, but it's not the heart that's failing. It's these other mechanisms that are failing, or there could be other things too. There could be damage to heart tissue that's creating, or an arrhythmia that's creating improper opening of valves that can create stagnant blood. So in that sense, maybe the heart's failing a little bit, but it's always made worse by these other mechanisms that maybe not be operating properly. And that's why the research on infrared sauna use, infrared light exposure to the body, are phenomenal for heart failure.
Mm-hmm.
There's just tons of research on that. So yeah, that's the first aspect. So yeah, and I'll let you make comments about that if you want to.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, what goes through my mind with all that, and I didn't want to interrupt you at all, but makes me think of deuterium, where you're
Mm.
talking about how we're splitting off that hydrogen. If we have heavy water, if we have this heavy, isotope of hydrogen in the deuterium, in the form of deuterium, maybe that's part of why the sauna is helping as well. We're sweating out some of the deuterium, and I know that that's a big piece of the puzzle why eating locally and seasonally is so important, to make sure we're mitigating our exposure to that deuterium, make sure it's the mitochondria that's responsible to make the exclusion zone water you were talking about, right? And I know it struggles, or I don't even know if it can make the exclusion zone water from deuterium water. So I guess that's my comment in form of a question too.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, very relevant. Obviously, deuterium interferes. Deuterium more interferes with the production of ATP
Mhm.
in complex 5.
Yeah.
But if that's clogged up, then the whole thing is clogged up, and you're probably not as making as much metabolic water. And mitochondria making water, yes, is one way that we definitely get structured water,
Mhm.
especially cellular structured water, which is
Sure.
super important. So yeah, yeah. And then eating local and in season, so you're getting less deuterium, and you're only getting deuterium in higher amounts when you're getting adequate sunlight exposure, which is, when higher deuterium foods are available is in summer.
Yeah.
But that also involves getting more sunlight exposure in the summer, because lots of people
Yeah.
don't. They stay inside.
Very
They
true.
try and avoid getting burned, which is logical because it hurts, but not logical because it doesn't cause skin cancer, that kind of stuff. So yeah, all very relevant stuff. And yeah, that heavy hydrogen could be interfering with the what molecular hydrogen is supposed to be doing.
Mhm. Very good. Yeah, that's interesting. It's the more I'm listening to these things, and so much information gets thrown at me, whether it's talking to Dr. Alexis Cowan, listening to yourself, Dr. Cruz, and all the different names out there. I'm really starting to connect more and more dots, and it's making an awful lot more sense. So I'm very grateful for it. Um, yeah, I think maybe we can touch upon some more of the cholesterol side of it then, as we alluded to before, just from the perspective of ultimately not fearing it, because it isn't what's causing the heart disease and such.
Yeah, definitely. So there's a whole backstory about cholesterol, a history of it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that when you read it, you're just like, why did we ever think this was the cause? Why do we ever think that this what was done was the thing that determined it was the cause? Because it makes no sense. But yeah, like in the early 1900s, coronary artery disease was very rare. It wasn't even really a thing. There was no College of Cardiology. There was no American Heart Association. It just wasn't a thing that was needed. And then yeah, mid century, 1950s, we started to see drastic rises in heart disease, coronary heart disease,
Mm-hmm.
because heart disease deaths were relevant, like heart attacks and cardiac arrests and things like that were happening, but coronary artery disease was not happening before them. And so, yeah, this guy, Ansel Keys, tried to give people an answer, and he did some very poorly done research. which is epidemiology, which can't really show anything, where he just compared the amount of saturated fat and cholesterol that certain countries ate. And then he looked at the rates of heart disease they had and saw that there was a correlation between the 7 countries that he looked at, but there was data from 22 countries at the time.
Yeah.
So he cherry picked the data pretty much. And later scientists repeat that study with all 22 countries, and they found no correlation. But there was a lot of money behind the theory from pharmaceutical companies and food industry. And so they kind of pushed the theory along, even though through the 60s and 70s, when they heavily tested the theory, they found the exact opposite, that the more or the lower your cholesterol was and the more unsaturated fat you ate, the more risk of heart disease you had. But those studies, the findings of those studies were kind of hushed up and pushed under the rug because the theory had already taken off and there's a lot of money behind it. But, more recently, we have a lot of literature showing us that, there's really no association with what your cholesterol, your LDL or total cholesterol is and rates of heart disease. I mean, there's studies that show that, people coming to the hospital with heart attacks have optimal levels. The vast majority of them coming with heart attacks have optimal levels. So it's obviously not, doesn't make sense for heart attacks. But the people will say, well, then there's atherosclerosis, and it causes atherosclerosis. But if you look at what atherosclerosis is, it's clotting tissue. There's no very little cholesterol present. It's like 87% plus or minus 8% clotting tissue, which is the same tissue that forms if I cut my skin and a clot forms, a scab forms to stop the bleeding. So that's the material we're dealing with, not this accumulation of cholesterol. But the most recent understanding, from my perspective, comes from the work of, these people that have turned themselves lean mass hyper responders, where they're just like, they go on low carbohydrate diets or carnivore diets. They restrict glucose and carbohydrates, and their LDL goes up for some people. Everybody's really goes up, but some people's it goes up really high. Like they would consider them having genetically high cholesterol if it weren't for seeing this phenomenon. Or they're assumed to have genetically high cholesterol when they're tested. But it always seems to occur in the context of very low metabolic risk, cardiometabolic risk, meaning they have good insulin sensitivity, they have low inflammation, things like that. And so what they're finding, and I think the study is supposed to be published fairly soon, this month, I think it is, Dave Feldman's group, they've looked at it and they've measured these people who have these significantly higher LDLs from eating a low carb diet, and they track them over 6 years of having this. And there's no relationship between the total plaque burden that they develop and having these things. And it wasn't just LDL. It was small dense particles. It was oxidized LDL. It was ApoB. It was LP(a). None of them were correlated with the amount of plaque burden in these people. And again, that's preliminary data that should be published this month. But people then say, well, what does measuring cholesterol tell us then? Well, it seems that it's telling us mainly about metabolism, what your body's metabolizing at the time. So if you are on a lower carbohydrate diet, the only choice your body has for a substrate to utilize for metabolism is fats. And your body has to deliver that fat to the tissue via LDL molecules. So if all you have, your body's trying to deliver more fat to tissues, you get more LDLs in the blood. And for some people, it's a lot more. And then if you ate more carbohydrates, your body could use those carbohydrates, that glucose. And so it wouldn't need as many fats delivered. So the LDL comes down. And that seems to be the case. So there's this one study, just an N of one experiment of a scientist at Harvard, where he was a low carb diet, and his LDL was elevated when he does that. And then, so he did that diet, and then he ate 12 Oreo cookies for 6 days, and his LDL plummeted when he did that. And then he went off the Oreos and he went back on his low carb diet, and his LDL went back up. And then he took a statin for 6 days. And the statin also lowered his LDL, but the Oreos worked much better at lowering LDL than the statin, which goes to show this is about energy metabolism. Are you utilizing more glucose or more fats? And that's basically what our lipids tell us. I mean, you can get a sense of inflammation if you look at oxidized LDL or small dense particles, but again, they don't seem to be correlated with amount of plaque. And you can get a sense of metabolic health if you look at triglyceride to HDL ratio, things like that. But otherwise, it's really just telling us about metabolism, and it's not a very useful indicator of risk for cardiovascular disease or for atherosclerosis. But that's kind of where the research is leading us. But it makes sense. I mean, if you look at what's happened over the last 80 years, 60 to 80 years, measuring lipids in blood and then aggressively treating that with a statin drug is not working.
Mm-hmm.
It's not working at all, because heart disease is still the number one killer. Heart disease rates are still the highest of any disease. Uh, and 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 there's actually evidence that statin drugs increase the amount of calcification in arteries and create insulin resistance, which is the number one risk factor for atherosclerosis. So it's a huge problem with that way of thinking that we're going to combat this disease with these drugs that lower cholesterol. Like it's not working, and there's plenty of harmful side effects. And all the studies that people use to tout the benefits of statins are heavily statistically manipulated,
Mm-hmm.
and the trials are manipulated and designed in ways that make it look more favorable than they actually are. And they report them as relative risk rather than absolute risk. And so there was actually a review paper that published in 2022 that looked at all those major statin trials, the Jupiter trial, the Ascot trial, the West of Scotland trial, 4S trial, all these different ones that they used to tout the benefits of statins. And they analyzed them as far as absolute risk, your absolute risk reduction of a heart attack. And they found there's pretty much no benefit.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas relative risk, they can say, oh, there's like 30% reduction. And because you're just manipulating statistics when you do that. So yeah, it makes no sense, and it's clearly not working. So we've got to get away from that model, and we have to look at new explanations and again, open the conversation so we can actually find the solution. And, that's what I'm trying to do for me personally. And that's what I did for me personally, and it worked. So we got to share that information.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was first introduced to some of that work from Dr. Asim Malhotra. He's been very vocal about that and about how it's more about our metabolic health. And, statins really aren't what we want them to be, aren't what they've been touted to be. And, he talks about the statistics. I don't recall them off the top of my head, but, that how minimal it is of any potential added days to life that statins provide versus what some other interventions would provide for us. As we're talking about, even just going a low carb diet, if we just talk about how individuals that make these changes feel. I know you experienced vegan for about a year, and you know how you felt then and numbers and all that. And then what a difference when you go carnivore for, what was it, 2 years you said, and that's when you healed your gut.
Yeah.
That stuff, even if we just consider them from N of one perspectives, that's a pretty substantial difference of testing vegan for a full year, giving it your all and not feeling good, and then going 2 years carnivore, feeling incredible, healing your gut for the first time in your life. That stuff has to be given the credence that it deserves, and we have to start to listen to that. So I'm 100% with you in that, from that capacity.
Yeah. I mean, we really, and it may start to sound like that I just hate research, but I don't. I read research all the time and I learn from it all the time. But it is a very myopic way of thinking about something. And it is very flawed to think about things that way when, all that matters is, all that ultimately matters to an individual is, how do you feel?
Mm-hmm.
Can you do the things you want to in your life? And unfortunately, the research and analyzing blood chemistry and all this stuff, they can be very useful, but they've also led us into this hyper reality of treating mechanisms in the body, treating biochemistry and treating blood biochemistry and that type of stuff, and not really asking ourselves, well, what makes a human feel better? Instead, we try and micromanage the lipids on there,
Mm-hmm.
right? And we say, well, your lipids are lower now because of the statin drug, so you're at less risk. You're like, but I feel terrible. I'm losing my memory and I have muscle pain. It's just like, yeah, but your lipids are lower, so you're going to be fine. And they end up dying of dementia or something like that. And it's just like, yeah, but your lipids were lower, so you're fine. And it's just like, you're still dead, because we're focusing on this hyper reality of treating blood work rather than treating a human. and what makes a human feel better. And I truly don't think we're ever really going to find any metric that tells us if we're healthy or not, other than how do you feel,
Yeah.
like, and that's the way humans have made it through however many years you believe humans have been here. That's how we made it, is we basically did something. Did it make us feel good or feel bad?
Yep.
And if it was so, drastic that it killed the person, then that's unfortunate for that individual. But guess what? Everyone around them just learned something. Don't do that, right? Don't eat that mushroom or whatever. That kind of stuff. Like, that's the way humans have been here. And so we have to stop. Like, there's this, it's like this, I don't know what the word is or what even to say, but it's like the literature and medicine has this stronghold
Hmm.
on health information, when in reality, your body has all the answers you need. You just have to listen to it and stop
Absolutely.
letting all these things get in the way. Again, that's not to say never get blood work, or it's not to say never read research. It's just that you have to take those things with a grain of salt and really listen to your body more. Like, people go on carnivore diets and their psoriasis goes away and their inflammation goes down. They lose a bunch of weight. They start thinking more clearly, and the LDL goes up, and they're like, "Oh my gosh, I'm going to die." It's like, think about that for a second. Like, maybe when we took LDL in the beginning, everyone was on a processed food, high carbohydrate diet. And so what we think is normal is actually
Mm.
what just happens if you have more carbohydrates in your diet. And LDL looks normal. It looks lower, I mean. And that's what we determined was normal. But we determined that in a population of people who are not living the way humans normally do. So is that true or not? It's
Yeah.
just kind of more of a philosophy than an exact science, but it's much needed, I think, in our world of health is more philosophy rather than the exact science.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I'll tell you, the in my life, when I got my healthiest, I felt my best, and I saw my physique change is when I stopped just doing what I was told was best for me, and I started listening to my body and seeing how I performed better. I think, and it makes me think too about you talked about it's not that you don't hate research. You're being critical, but you like it, you read it. I think there's a similarity here that in our education system early on, we get taught to pretty much sit down, shut up, listen to me, the authority figure, and regurgitate back to me what I just told you to show me that you're a good little boy and good little girl. And if you do that, I'll pat you on the back and give you your A and move you on. And you experienced that through high school, you graduated, you went to college, and you learned in college real quick that you didn't learn how to learn, you learned how to regurgitate. And now I think that was the best thing that could have happened to you, because now when you read the literature, you're not doing it to regurgitate it. You're doing it to understand it and challenge it and push back. And I think very similarly, that's what I went through earlier in my career as a personal trainer, taking the information we were taught. I mean, it was 60% minimum carbohydrates is what you're supposed to be eating, especially for those of you that are active in the gym. You need it. Your brain's number one source of energy is that glycogen from the carbohydrates. Eat it, eat it, eat it. And man, I kept looking in the gym at these other people who were super lean, and I'm like, but they're eating too much protein. They're not eating enough carbs. How are they doing that? How are they looking and feeling so good? I'm like, I'm doing what's right. And man, I did it for way longer than I'd like to admit. But eventually I made that change, and I watched my body change, and I felt better. Now I'm more metabolically flexible. Now I have mental clarity when I go through a fast, and just all these different things that, as you alluded to, you need to learn to listen to your body and almost do your own N of one experiment and see. Don't go just based on, oh, this tasted really good, so I like it, I'll have more of it. It's if it tasted good, but 20 to 60 minutes later you feel like garbage and you're in a sugar coma. I don't think that's working very well for you. So I'm 100% with you there, that we have to just get people, hopefully get conversations like this in front of more people and empower them to begin to listen to their own bodies. And I think taking that same thought process, I'll ask you to tell me a little bit more about collaterals, because my speculation would be that you listening to your body and trying to understand what was actually going on got you to understand that a little bit more and understand maybe how the system's working a little bit better with the damage you had experienced.
Yeah, I mean, trying to figure out why exactly I had a heart attack led me down this route. And basically, it's assumed that a heart attack is caused by this gradual stenosis and of a coronary artery, and it slowly narrows and narrows and eventually becomes blocked, or some soft plaque ruptures, and then that causes a clot to form that blocks the entire area right there. But looking at the literature, there's not really much sound evidence that that's the case,
Mm-hmm.
that happens. And so the work of this guy named Giorgio Beraldi, he found that anytime a narrowing of an artery does happen, it gets to about 60% narrowed, the body builds collaterals around it. Collaterals being like arteries that go from one side to the other around the stenosis, and
Mm-hmm.
they fully compensate the heart with blood. And he said that in all the autopsies he did throughout his entire career, which he probably did thousands of them, he found that it happens 100% of the time when it gets to about 60% blocked. And they happen pretty fast. They've done experiments in rats and in dogs where the collaterals can form enough to fully compensate the heart within 4 days.
Hmm.
So very quick.
Wow.
But but those collaterals explain why, when you look at the literature on elective stent procedures and
Mm-hmm.
bypass surgeries, like they don't make a difference.
Hmm.
Whether people have them or not, they're just as likely to have a heart attack because they did nothing to address the clotting risk in those people. They just tried to divert blood flow, which the body's already done with collaterals if it's 60% narrowed or more. So yeah, it doesn't really make sense to try and open up the area of stenosis or do another bypass with a vein because it's already been done. And again, they don't work. They don't help people prevent heart attacks. And so what we really need to do is optimize that blood flow and prevent clotting in
Hmm.
those people who have these stenoses, rather than trying to treat the lesion, treat the stenosis itself. And there's a
Right.
fascinating paper that talks about this called The Myth of the Vulnerable Plaque that it was published in 2015. Very good paper. But yeah, so we should be trying to keep blood flowing. And we talked about how that happens.
Yeah.
We talked about how blood flows, which is structured water in the arteries. And so we need to maintain that blood flow, protect the lining of the arteries, keep the elements of blood from sticking together. And that is all building structured water in arteries. That's what it does for us. And so if you think about the main way that structured water forms is infrared light exposure.
Mm-hmm.
And you think about since the 1950s, what have humans been doing? We've drastically decreased our infrared light exposure
Yep.
because we invented fluorescent lights and then later LED bulbs. And so we live indoors out of the sun under this artificial light that has no infrared. And so we're extremely lacking in infrared light. And that takes away the arteries protection and our source of adequate blood flow, which leads to clotting. That's why that's why this is happening for the most part. In addition to the increase in toxin exposure and the processed food diets, and then disrupted circadian rhythm, like all that stuff is playing a role too.
Mm-hmm.
But the main issue is we removed ourselves from infrared light. That's a huge problem, and so we need more of that to protect the arteries and prevent. And the reason it happens more in coronary arteries is because they're under the most pressure.
Sure.
So, like when there's things damaging the line of the artery, or when there's poor stagnant blood flow, like in a turn in an artery, which is where most heart attacks happen, is when there's a turn or curve in an artery,
Mm-hmm.
then things just get more stagnant and there's more pressure pushing things into the lining of the artery, creating more damage, endothelial disruption. So yeah, I mean, that's the real answer right there.
Yeah. That makes total sense. And just for clarity for the listeners, the collaterals, the way I think about that is it's kind of like if we're on the highway and there's a lot of congestion, maybe an accident, and there's an off ramp and there's some side roads to get around. That's essentially what those collaterals are doing, is giving it somewhere else to go and keep it moving. But so to your point, the clotting is the real problem, kind of like the accident in that analogy. And what we need is to just keep it moving. So we need to make sure we're making that exclusion zone water, that metabolic water, and able to get the blood moving through the body. That's fantastic. That just makes so much sense. So for somebody that, whether they've experienced some issues with this or not, a great way to get started, if they're similar to us, kind of looking for an alternative approach, I love it. The grounding, the infrared, the circadian, get in sync with the circadian rhythm. So get up in time to see the sunrise, preferably see it outside, touching the ground, no glasses on, no sunglasses on, skin, eyes exposed to the sun without staring directly at it, of course, all those things. So I guess one big question I have for you, I know you're very into the infrared sauna, which I totally support, but from the benefit of your mitochondria then creating the infrared light, are you into cold thermogenesis at all? Whether it's,
Yeah.
cold air, cold water, cold plunge, ice bath, what have you.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, those are great ways to optimize your metabolism, your mitochondria. They also induce like mitophagy and stuff. So,
Mm-hmm.
like, old mitochondria that aren't working very well get killed off and new ones are made.
Yep.
But yeah, we make infrared in light, infrared heat. That's what our body heat is. So, if you can do things to encourage your body to make heat, like exercise and exposing your body to cold, or just getting more acclimatized to cold in the winter, spending more time outside, even cold showers, that type of stuff.
Yep.
When the water's coming out of the pipes nice and cold, those types of things are very beneficial to create more infrared heat, which is more structuring to water or energizing to water so that it will structure itself. Yeah.
Awesome. Oh, that's fantastic. Let me think. I think that's a ton. I know we just bombarded the listeners with a lot, and I'm still processing it all. But I do believe the things that I definitely wanted from you, we got. So we know the 3 books; they're all available on Amazon, right?
Yep. The health
Um,
evolution, understanding the heart, and pain sense. Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. And where else? I know I follow you Instagram predominantly, but I've seen a ton of your podcasts now on YouTube, different channels out there. So what's the best way for people to follow along? And I know you also do some coaching, so hopefully we can send some people to you. Where would they find you that way?
Yeah, my website is resourceyourhealth.com.
Okay.
And, my recommended products are on there. My blog is on there, which I don't post on too often, but my health consulting links are on there. My health community, all the different stuff you would find about me is on there. And then I'm on social media. Yeah, it's just Dr. Stephen Hussey, Dr. Stephen Hussey. People can reach out to me there too.
Fantastic. This was great. I'm so grateful for your time, and I'm certain the audience is as well. So, guys, if you stuck through to the end here, which I'm certain you did with Dr. Hussey throwing us so much information, make sure to subscribe, comment, like, share, all that good stuff, and go check out Dr. Hussey's stuff. And we'll see you next time. Thanks so much. Thanks, Dr. Hussey.
Thank you.